All right, so today we're going to be going over the First Amendment and particularly what is protected and what is not protected by the First Amendment. First, I want to ask you guys, in the language of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, what rights are protected under the First Amendment? There's 5.
Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of like you can go out and protest.
Assembly.
Yes, freedom of assembly and speech, press, religion, assembly. What?
This is one that gets everyone.
Petition.
Yes.
Petition.
The right to petition to redress grievances. Okay, Alexandra needs to get a candy bar. She's on top of this. She might not even need to be here, but she's going to stay because it would make me happy. Great. Good job. Yes. So those are the 5 rights that are protected under the First Amendment. The problem with that is, what does that even mean, right? Because you hear freedom of speech. So does that mean that I can go out right now and say whatever I want and do whatever I want because it's the freedom of speech? No. In order for us to understand what the First Amendment gives us and what rights we have to have the interpretation of it. And that's where the courts come in. And that's where we formulated and began to understand how we understand the First Amendment today. Now, what's interesting to me about freedom of speech is not everybody's going to have the same interpretation. But what I'm going to try to provide for you is a foundation, a way of understanding this so that as you go out as journalists or even as students, you have a firm understanding of what you can and cannot do legally, so you kind of stay out of like the hot water, okay? All right. This is an extremely reductive history of the First Amendment, but it's kind of important for you guys to understand that how we understand freedom of speech today and the press is not how it's always been. So you want to remember that the First Amendment was ratified in 1791 in the Bill of Rights, and it only applied to the federal government. So state governments had the ability to create their own laws and regulations regarding speech of their citizens as well as the press. So it only applied to the federal government. And then you have to understand that the United States actually has a long history of censoring speech. So from 1798 to 1801, they had the Alien and Sedition Acts. This act basically made it illegal to say anything negative about the president, his cabinet, individuals like that. Interestingly enough, the vice president was not included in this. Does anybody know why? Why wouldn't they include the vice president at this time? Well, how was the vice president chosen at that time? It was the runner-up. So during this era, the president was the person who got the most votes, and the person who got the second votes was the runner-up. So think about it with the election that just passed. Biden got the most votes. Trump had the runner-up. Can you imagine a presidency where the vice president would be like that? They're in contention. So when they wrote the Alien and Sedition Acts, they very much knew that they wanted to protect their inner circle, but they threw the vice president, they accidentally forgot him, so that people could still write sort of scandalous, rhetorical sort of things about them, and that's what the Alien Sedition Acts actually prevented people from doing. So in the 19th century, we had the First Amendment, but we didn't have the First Amendment. So this is called the antebellum period. So during this time, it's sort of a myth that there were no challenges to the First Amendment. There were, but every time the court heard these cases, they sided with the state. They always deferred to the state's ability to lay down the laws and regulations for their land, right? So you have that period, it goes, and goes. And then in 1917, you have World War I beginning, and the Espionage Act occurs. So the Espionage Act made it illegal for anyone to publish any information that went against the military. So you couldn't tell people not to join the draft. You couldn't, obviously release information about troop whereabouts and things like that. But you couldn't speak negatively of the government. And then in 1919, we have the case Schenck v. the United States. And this is a really important case because this is the first case where we see the First Amendment actually begin to shape and form as we understand it today. So in this case, Schenck was a communist who was handing out pamphlets that told people to resist the draft. And he was charged with conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act. He was convicted, but he appealed, and he appealed all the way to the Supreme Court under the argument that the First Amendment protected his right to publish this information. So he lost the case. The Supreme Court actually ruled that no, you cannot disseminate information that would harm the military in some way, and asking people to disobey the draft is very much harming them. This was a unanimous decision. So that's important. A unanimous decision means that everybody on the court agreed with this. They were all in agreement. So in their opinion, they stated that the government has a great latitude to manage the public, including limiting constitutional rights during times of war. That's important because that has stuck around even into today. During times of war, our rights are diminished in the interest of public safety. Now, there's different ways that can be done, but the courts will always side with the state pretty much in times of war because they want to make sure that they have the authority to protect the citizens as well as to protect their interests while they're at war. However, that can be abused, which very much I would say in Schenck, in this case it was, because the gentleman was only handing out pamphlets. He wasn't actually trying to overthrow the government or doing acts of anarchy. But we have to remember this is coming right out of the antebellum period. So at this point, they're always kind of ruling in siding with the state. So during that opinion, they wrote the phrase that told people that the First Amendment does not protect speech that poses a clear and present danger. So that became the test. That became how the Supreme Court was going to determine whether speech was protected or not. Does this speech qualify as a clear and present danger? And also, this is one of the most often quoted lines of any justice. Oliver Wendell Holmes, right? A citizen cannot falsely. I want you to remember the falsely because typically people just say people can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Well, you can if the theater's on fire. But he wrote that you cannot falsely yell fire in a crowded theater. So the First Amendment does not protect everything. This case is important because it set down two major guidelines. One, that the First Amendment was non-absolute. And two, that they're seeing a crack in the court where they're starting to recognize that the First Amendment has to protect some speech. Because when they said that it can't protect speech that is a clear and present danger, what that meant was that it had to protect speech that could not be qualified as that, right? So now you're seeing this idea of it being an individual right, which is how we understand it today. We understand it that each citizen in this country has the right to free speech and that the press has the right to press. So we're seeing as an individual right. And so even though Schenck lost in this case, it's really important because this is the one that put a crack in the whole idea of what the First Amendment means. The next case that was really important is Gitlow v. New York. Again, in this case, he was a socialist and he was arrested for distributing a left-wing manifesto that called for the establishment of socialism through strikes and class actions. He was convicted under New York's criminal anarchy law, which punished the advocacy of overthrowing the government. He appealed all the way through. It gets to the Supreme Court. And he was arguing he had a First Amendment right for this publication. Gitlow lost too. So the Supreme Court still said, no, that's a clear and present danger. You're trying to overthrow the government. That's not protected by the First Amendment. But what this case did was it applied the federal supremacy doctrine of the 14th Amendment to incorporate the First Amendment. So when a bill, or when the First Amendment was incorporated, what we mean is that now it applies to each individual regardless of their state. So the entire nation was now protected by the First Amendment. Each person in the nation had a guarantee to free speech and press, which previously they hadn't, because it had been the state's authority to write legislation that would dictate what speech was protected or not. So that's why this was a big case, because even though Gitlow lost, this is where our modern First Amendment doctrine starts to evolve. It's coming out of the Warren Court. The Warren Court expanded First Amendment rights by recognizing freedom of speech as an individual right, which required the government to do more than to follow prior restraint doctrine. It had to serve to protect the First Amendment. So what it did was it said that the government not only has the right to determine what can and cannot be said, they have the obligation to protect the citizens' guaranteed rights to free speech and press. And then the Warren Court also created the right to privacy, which as journalists, that's kind of a big deal. Everyone talks about invasion of privacy. And they did so under the understanding that the right to privacy was in the penumbra of the Constitution. So it's not explicitly written. There's no right to privacy in the Constitution anywhere. What the Warren Court did is they looked at the Constitution in its entirety and they said, look, there is an implication here that people have a right to privacy. They have a right to self. They have a right to not have their, lives thrown out in the press for no reason, as well as not to have their lives invaded by the government. So they created the Bill of Rights, or they created, the right to privacy, which we now, as journalists, still use today as an understanding that there are certain lines that we can and cannot cross, given that people have that expectation of privacy. Are there any questions so far?
I asked how the First Amendment was not absolute. Like, what does not absolute mean?
Okay. So if the First Amendment were to be, I'm not seeing the chat thing come up, so I apologize. If the First Amendment were to be an absolute, it would mean that everything you say and publish is protected. Everything you say. So you could go out right now and declare that you are starting the next civil war, that you are armed and that you're getting your army together, and no one can stop you because you were speaking. And even though that would be an illegal act under the idea of, fighting words and whatnot, you would be protected. So with it not being an absolute, it means that some forms of speech are protected. So you can say some things, but other forms of speech are not protected. So other forms of speech, and we'll get to these, that you can't say are things that are obscene, things that are considered fighting words. And there's like two other ones, and we'll go over those. I don't want to show you too much, but that means that you can't say everything and expect to be protected by the First Amendment. That's what that means. Are there any other questions? No? Okay. Oh, I see where there. Nope. Yeah, I don't have the chat box for some reason on mine, so I'm getting you guys say things. I don't know why it's not there. I was just looking. All right.
There aren't any other questions populating it in chat right now. You're good.
Okay. So, the First Amendment rationales and doctrine today. What this means is this is the guiding understanding of the First Amendment. Okay. This is the purpose. What is the purpose of the First Amendment? So, this helps the courts determine if something is protected by the First Amendment, a form of speech or publication, based on does it meet these qualifications. So the first one is based on John's argument that the First Amendment is an absolute when used as a form of dissent or to critique the government. So it is an absolute if what the person is doing is critiquing or dissenting from the government. Under that theory, think back to the protests that were happening over the summer. Would that, with that understanding, would that allow the president to send in troops to break up the protest? Or would that be considered a protected form of speech? Any ideas?
Can you repeat that question?
So taking into account John's argument that the First Amendment is an absolute, meaning that as long as the speech is used as a form of dissent from the government or critique of the government, it cannot be infringed. It cannot be penalized or stopped. Taking his argument, would that mean that over the summer when the president sent in troops in certain areas to stop the protests for the Black Lives Matter movement, would that mean that that was a violation of those individuals' First Amendment rights?
Yeah, I think it was, because like in the First Amendment states, it says we have the right to protest.
Yeah, but also looking at John's, the point of what they were doing was to critique the government. So in that aspect, their speech would be protected. It would not be able to be infringed upon because these individuals were critiquing the government and dissenting from the state. The other 4 reasons that are used to weigh whether or not a speech would be protected is the idea that the First Amendment is meant to provide individuals with self-fulfillment. So when we talk about self-fulfillment, we're not talking about it makes me really happy to say this. What we mean is that it gives the individual a sense of purpose. It gives the individual an understanding. It can bring them into the community or to challenge the community when they feel oppressed, those type of things. That's what we mean by self-fulfillment. Also, free speech is to be protected because it is meant to advance knowledge and discover the truth. This is known as the marketplace of ideas. So the First Amendment should not or should protect any speech where there are dueling ideas and the 2 people are speaking, because the idea is that the listeners are discerning which answer is actually the truth and that the truth will prevail. Next, the First Amendment doctrine is that participation in decision-making by all members of society is guaranteed. So in a democratic society, it's not democratic if the members of the society cannot participate. So if you cannot challenge your government, or if you cannot challenge even the university, you're not in a democratic society. And so it has to be protected in order to ensure that individuals have the right to participate within their society. And then also, the First Amendment is intended to maintain the proper balance between stability and change. So the First Amendment, the purpose of it here is to keep people from constantly overthrowing the government. Because one of the things about the First Amendment when it was created under the understanding, because remember, we're just coming off of America getting its own independence. They did so through revolt, that if people don't have an outlet, if they don't have the ability to address their concerns with authority figures, then they do have the right, or if you ask Jefferson, the obligation to revolt. So by protecting freedom of speech, we're able to maintain a balance that allows people to affect change within our society without having to go through acts of violence. So speech that's protected by the First Amendment. And these are the decision guidelines and permissible restrictions. So most speech is protected by the First Amendment. But when the court is looking at whether a form of speech is permissible, they have to apply strict scrutiny to it. So when they're applying strict scrutiny, that means that when the state is trying to limit or regulate speech, they have to do so in a narrowly tailored manner, which means the least restrictive. If we think about the rock on campus, right? So if UT were to decide that they have a compelling interest, which is the second part of that, to stop people from painting the rock, they would have to do it in the least restrictive way. And so they could say no one can paint the rock and leave the rock on campus, but that's not really the least restrictive way in that sort of hypothetical. The least restrictive way for that would be to take the rock off campus so that individuals no longer have access to it. So they're not telling people who can and cannot paint the rock and what you can and cannot say. It's just no longer available. It's no longer a space, which brings us to the second part. When the government is proving the law, is when the government proves the law abridging freedom of speech is content neutral, because if they take the rock away, they're not telling people you can't put X, Y, and Z on the rock. They're saying, doesn't matter what you put. If it was Go Vols or Smokey's My Best Friend, doesn't matter. We've taken the rock away. No one can put anything on it. So it's content neutral. They're not punishing people for things that go up on the rock, like swastikas and white pride and things like that. They're content neutral. It doesn't matter what was up there. No one's going to be able to use it. And then they have to provide a compelling interest. So UT then would have to argue why they're moving the rock. Now, they cannot, in that hypothetical, argue that they're really concerned about, the welfare of certain students based on what was said. Because remember, it has to be content neutral. But they could come up with another compelling reason, like the rock's getting old. We're afraid that pieces might start falling and hitting students. They have to come up with a compelling reason. And if they use the safety of the students, that's compelling enough. And they would be able to do it. And then they also have to prove that there are other avenues for the speakers to use. So UT would just have to say, yeah, they can't paint the rock anymore, but we do allow students to request space, throughout the university to hold meetings, to talk and discuss and to share ideas. So they still have other ways of getting their content out. They just can't use the rock anymore. And the rock would be gone. So UT would have had then the authority to place time, place, and manner restrictions on your speech. Because we all know in that hypothetical what UT is doing, right? They're intending to get you to not be able to put your message on the rock. That's what they're trying to do. But they have found other ways by making sure that it was a content neutral argument, that they have provided a compelling reason that had nothing to do with speech, and that, they've ensured that students will still be able to say what they want to, when they want to, because the, probability of any student walking around saying anything that would be hateful is far less likely, and they would be protected by that. So, are there any questions about that? So that brings us to the types of speech that are not protected. So the types of speech that are not protected are obscenity, defamation, fighting words, and then words that cause imminent lawless action. So we'll explain imminent lawless action, but essentially, spoiler alert, what that means is that you cannot say something that is likely in the immediate future to produce an action that is lawless. So you cannot call for a riot in the moment where people are hot in tension and they're ready to riot, have the riot happen and say, well, I just said to do it, I wasn't a part of it. No, that's not protected speech. So fighting words are defined as words, those by which their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of peace. It has been well observed that such utterances are no essential part in the exposition of ideas and are such a slight social value as to step to truth that any benefit may be derived with them is clearly outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. That is a fancy way of saying that fighting words, they don't have any value. So they do not tick any of those boxes when we're talking about those 5 rationales of the First Amendment. They don't tick those. They're not helping advance the truth. They're not, giving people really a sense of self-fulfillment, because again, it's not just what makes you happy. And so fighting words are not protected. And that is under the assumption that a reasonable person, when, hearing these words, would be brought to action. And that was decided in the case Champsky v. New Hampshire. That's where fighting words was defined and then determined not to have First Amendment protections. Next, you have the imminent lawless action, and hate speech is how I kind of put it, because that's really what would fall under here. You have the case Brandenburg v. Ohio. In that case, it was dealing with the Ku Klux Klan. They had, burned crosses on somebody's front lawn. Ohio had a regulation that said that you could not do that. Ohio lost because, one, it wasn't content neutral because they said you couldn't burn crosses, and the court did not accept the argument that they were protecting individuals. So from that came the 2-prong test. It said, it said that speech can be prohibited if it's directed at inciting and producing imminent lawless actions. Like I said, your speech that immediately causes people to break the law is not protected, and you are liable for that speech. So the way that I define it is the court understands it like this. If it can't reasonably happen, then it's protected. So if you're at a rally and you say, we're going to kill all the Bobs, that would be protected, because you could not, even at that rally, kill all the Bobs. There's so many Bobs in the world. But if you're at the rally and Bob lives up the street and there's only one Bob, and you say, we're going to kill Bob, that is not protected, because that could happen, and it could happen in an immediate moment. And then that's why it has to be likely to incite or produce that action. So if you're at that rally and you're like, we're going to go kill Bob, and people have guns and pitchforks and torches, it's likely to happen. But if you're at the rally and it's 800 miles away from Bob and nobody has any weapons, everyone's just listening, well, then it's not likely to produce that action, so it would be protected. So this also created the precedent that hate speech is protected in America. So you can, not that you all would, but individuals can participate in hate speech. That's why they can put swastikas on the rock and not be criminally charged for it, because hate speech is protected, because, again, you can't kill all the Bobs. So that's what hate speech is basically saying. We're going to kill all the Bobs, and you can't possibly kill all the Bobs. So it's protected. It's not likely to occur. And the reason why the Supreme Court has been reluctant to stop hate speech is because they use the slippery slope argument that says if we define this as hate speech, then we're going to start losing all of our speech, because then somebody else will say they're offended, then somebody else will say they're offended, and pretty soon we won't have freedom of speech anymore. So the third form of speech that is not protected is obscenity. So obscenity and indecency are two different things. Indecency is protected by the First Amendment. So indecency is sexual or non-sexual messages that are considered clearly offensive. So even if something is clearly offensive, like it's intended to offend, it's still protected by the First Amendment. Pornography falls under that as being indecent, unless it's knowingly shared with minors, but the ability to produce, watch, consume pornography is protected, because even though it's indecent, because there are individuals who are offended by it, it is an expression and it has a message, and so it's protected by the First Amendment. Obscenity, however, it refers to sexually graphic material that has been deemed illegal by a court. So for something to be obscene, it has to break the mores and norms of the entire country. So it means that every reasonable person will be offended by this. The biggest one with this is child pornography. Child pornography is considered obscene, while adult pornography is not. And that's because overall, most Americans, and I mean most, believe that child pornography is a vile and disgusting act. What's interesting about obscenity versus indecency is that how the precedent is right now, how we understand the difference, is basically the court saying, I know it when I see it. So what qualifies something as indecent and obscene, because child pornography is kind of an easy one, other things aren't, the court looks at it, reviews it, and says, no, that's indecent, not obscene. One of the most recent rulings where this came out was the ability to share animal torture videos on social media. It was brought to the court not that long ago, and people said it was obscene. The court actually ruled, no, it's indecent, because yes, it offends people, but it doesn't, break that barrier of I know it when I see it. So they also use the I know it when I see it as defined in the Miller test. And it says that whether an average person applying contemporary community standards would find that work taken as a whole appeals to prurient interest. So that is, would modern, in the moment, people seeing this, would it excite them in some sort of way that is either sexual in nature or perverted in one way or another? And then it is whether the work depicts or describes in an offensive way sexual conduct that is, forbidden and specifically defined by the laws, and whether the work taken as a whole, and this is the important part, lacks literary or serious literary, artistic, political, and scientific value. That is our obscene test now. It's called the SLAPS test. And it asks if any piece of work can at least argue that it has a serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value, even though it's offensive, it will be protected. Okay. Are there any questions about that? Finally, defamation. This is one that's really big for you all as you go into the journalist field, because this is what will get you in trouble. Defamation, when it is in the written form, so when you actually publish it, is called libel. And when it's spoken, when you speak defamation, it is called slander. Defamation are any statements that are made to harm someone's otherwise good reputation. The point there being a good reputation. So if you say something and it doesn't harm someone's reputation because the whole community already sees them as, a person of ill repute, it's not defamation, okay? So the content generator, in this case would be you, the journalist, they have to know that the statement they're making is false. They have to know that they are not telling the truth. That's why, as I'm sure you all, wait, no, you're 175. You'll find out next semester when you get into 200 and to 230. Your teachers will continuously tell you to cite your sources. Make sure you have multiple sources, because that's how you protect yourself from a liable lawsuit, is that you do your due diligence. So you know to the best of your ability in the moment when you're publishing something that this is the truth. Now, it could come out later that you have been conned and you were played, and then you will redact that, but you have to have more than one person verifying this, because individuals, they have their own reasons for doing things. So if somebody doesn't like an individual, they can go to the press, say all these things, and then you print it and it turns out to all be false. You're still on the hook for that because you took that one person's word and you did not verify it in any way. You have to verify it so that you can say that in that moment, even if it turns out to be false, you believed it to be true. For libel to occur, and this is something that I think students maybe should want to know, it only takes 3 people. So it takes the person that writes it, the content generator. It takes the person that's being defamed, who you're writing about. And it only takes one other person to claim that the defamation changed their view of an individual. So it only takes 3 people. You don't have to publish something on a widespread New York Times sort of circulation. You can actually commit libel in a group chat. So if you are in a class and you all get your group me's going and you put something that is defamatory in there, you all wouldn't, but let's say somebody else does in a different class, put something that is defamatory. It's false. There's no evidence to verify it. They're just speaking poorly of your professor, and your professor has like a good reputation, and that changes something, and everyone decides they're going to write bad evaluations. That is considered libel. The professor could sue. Oop. Hold on. Oop. Let me go back. Because the 3 people have done it, and the fact that you put it on the internet constitutes publication. So remember that. Just kind of as a good rule of thumb, whenever you are in a group chat or something along those lines, don't say anything you wouldn't want someone to say about your mama or you wouldn't want your mama to read. There's the easiest way to avoid that. So next is the understanding that libel torts are civil torts, meaning that the perpetrator, the person that commits the defamation, cannot, be imprisoned. They can't be thrown in jail, but they can have a monetary fine. So you could have to pay a lot of money for writing something that maybe in the heat of the moment you were really into, and then later, it comes back to bite you. There are defenses for libel. So if someone says that you have committed libel, but you know that you have not, there's 5 ways that you can defend them. The first is the truth is an absolute defense. If it happened, even if the person doesn't want you to share this, doesn't want that information out, it hurts their reputation, it doesn't matter, it happened, you have a right to publish it. You also have the fair comment. So if you're critiquing a play or something along those lines, you have a right to say that it was terrible, that it was produced poorly, even if that ruins the reputation of the director and they can't get a job anywhere. You have a right to do that. But when you're going to write any kind of article that requires a fair comment where you're critiquing something, you have to make sure that when you go to the play, you wear your press badge, you make it clear that you are there as a member of the press, and that you get all of your little details right. So if you see the play on Saturday, you cannot accidentally write in your review that the play happened on Friday. So you have to make sure your details are right, and that's how you have a fair comment defense. Next is consent to publish. Consent to publish is when an individual allows you to publish something, and then when they realize that, oh wait, I shouldn't have said that, that's not good, they can't take it back. There's no backseas. So if someone gives you consent to publish, even if it ends up defaming or harming their reputation, they've given you that authority to do so, and so you don't have a libel case. Next is absolute privilege and qualified privilege. I'll just let you know that those 2 kind of privileges are what allow you to quote individuals who may be talking poorly and defaming somebody else, but you're not the one that's saying it, and they're in certain places like the courtroom or on the state house and things like that. Okay. This class gets over at 10:50, right? Is that right? What time does this class end? Can someone tell me?
I think it's 11.
I think
Okay.
it's 11:05.
11 yep, that's right.
Okay. All right, thank you. I can't remember. All right. So there is a difference between defamation libel of a private figure and defamation of a public figure. It is harder to win a libel lawsuit against a public figure than it is to win a libel lawsuit as a private figure. Okay. So a private person is an individual that is not well known and not seeking attention. So you all are private individuals. You are able to have a greater expectation that you will not be defamed versus Kanye West, right? So someone covering him and his campaign, he has less of an expectation that he will be libeled or won't be libeled in sort of way. So public figures can be public officials or any other person that's pervasively involved in a public affair. So there's celebrity, business leaders, and politicians. Those type of people are considered public people. But also, if you involve yourself in a public controversy, you can be considered a limited purpose public figure for a particular set of issues. So if you save the president from being shot, that's actually a case, and people write things about you and it harms your reputation, but they happen to be true, but it still harms your reputation. Because you made yourself a news story, because you chose to save the president, you're now newsworthy and you are then moved up into the spot of being a public figure, at least in that moment. So anything that surrounds that issue, it's really hard to prove a libel lawsuit for. So to win a libel lawsuit for a private person, they just have to prove that the publisher that made the false statements acted negligently. So that's where it goes back to getting more than one person to tell you this information, verifying information. Because if you run the story with just that one person, that's negligent. A private figure could sue and they could win. However, in contrast, I didn't put either, to win a libel suit, a public figure has to prove that the publisher of the false statements acted with actual malice. Actual malice means that publishers either knew that the statements were false or acted with a reckless disregard for the truth. This, as journalists, this case, New York Times v. Sullivan, this is the one that you guys should carry in your hearts with you at all times, because this is what really protects journalists, okay? In this case, Martin Luther King was in jail. Preachers and supporters of him ran an ad in the New York Times talking about the atrocities that were occurring in Alabama at the time against the civil rights movement and leaders, and they were calling to raise money to help bail out Martin Luther King. Well, in that particular ad, Sullivan, who was a sheriff down there in Alabama, he had read it and he felt offended by it. He felt offended by it. So he sued for libel. Now, the New York Times did not take this seriously originally because they hadn't named him. Remember when we talked about the 3 people that have to be there? Well, they're missing that part about the person you're defaming because it was not named. They were talking about the police in general and the treatment of the civil rights movement. They didn't say Sheriff Sullivan's an evil person. Well, this was Alabama during the civil rights movement. Who do you think would win that case? It would be Sullivan. The racist sheriff, surprise, surprise, won against the New York Times. They found them guilty for libel because they had gotten certain details wrong. certain things about a song that was sung at a protest, um, sort of just minute details. And then they won a whole bunch of money, and the amount of money they won would actually bankrupt and put the New York Times out of business. So at this point, the New York Times had no choice but to appeal and to take this all the way through to the Supreme Court. They appealed all through, the levels down in Alabama, and racist gonna racist, and they just kept ruling for Sullivan, kept ruling for him. He kept winning. He gets to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court reads it, and they look at it, and they realize that yes, there were minor falsities in this. They didn't get everything exactly right, but in whole, they did. And they also, the things they didn't get right, they weren't done so with the intent to mislead or to misguide. And this is where journalism began to be protected, because it protects journalists from liable suits if they have not committed actual malice. Actual malice means that you are defaming the individual, that you're lying, that you have not done your due diligence in any way to verify anything, and that's how you can be sued for libel. But if you get some minor details wrong, in the interest of having the public have access to information, journalists have to be able to, in good faith, print something. Because if not, we would spend our entire day making sure that everything that everyone has told us is correct, and we wouldn't have time to actually produce anything and to inform the public. So New York Times v. Sullivan is like the one case that I think you guys should start now carrying with you, because you'll hear it a lot, and that is the one that has defined journalists today. Are there any questions about that? Privacy. So privacy is the idea, like I said, that's in the penumbra. It's not actually spelled out in the Constitution. And this is the gray area of the Constitution, and you don't always have privacy, but you do sometimes. So privacy of autonomy is private and personal decisions of autonomous individual free from the government's interference or intrusion. So that particular rationale is what you would use, or was used in like Roe v. Wade, things along those lines. It's that it's a private decision of an individual. It does not have a victim. It doesn't harm anyone. And so an individual has the expectation to have autonomy over their own selves and their own space. So the privacy of space is people have physical zoned privacy for which others may not intrude. So if you're trying to get a story and you really want the story, you can't just walk into the person's house and start asking them questions. They have an expectation of privacy. But if they are in public, they do not have an expectation of privacy. And so you can bombard them asking them questions. It's important to know that when you're in public, you do not have an expectation of privacy. So even now, if you decided that you were going to go streaking down, the boulevard, the strip over there, and people happen, which they would nowadays, take a whole bunch of pictures of it, your name gets published, it's printed, everyone's saying, look at this person, they streak, they're, that, and the pictures are up on the thing. You can't say, oh, that was a private moment, I was just joking with my friends. You can't publish it because you're in public. Anything you do in public that is newsworthy, you cannot expect to have privacy about. Okay. There's also privacy of information, that's facts and data about oneself that should not be revealed by others. That's things like tax returns. People aren't supposed to reveal those. Excuse me. But you do have an expectation that if you share something in confidence with your doctor, you have a privacy of information. They can't go share that with everyone, right? And then the types of privacy torts, again, these are civil case laws, are disclosure of embarrassing and private facts about an individual. So as a journalist, you could be sued for a violation of somebody's privacy if you disclose embarrassing and private facts about somebody, particularly if they are a private citizen, without it having some sort of newsworthy value. Intrusion of privacy, this is where you physically or technologically intrude on someone. So again, you can't go in their house, but you also can't run a microphone through a window and record them while they're in there. That's an invasion of privacy through technology. So you can't basically record someone in moments where they think they're not being recorded, and there's that expectation of not having the reporter there listening. And there's also a false light. This is kind of liable light is what we call it, because it is not publishing an outright lie. It's publishing something in such a way that the context morphs what actually happened. So if you publish something and all your facts are right, everything's in line, but you write it in such a way that it changes what happened, that holds you liable, and they can sue you for an invasion of privacy. And also you have appropriation, which is the use of another person's likeness without their permission. Under the idea of privacy, an individual has an expectation that they own their likeness, right? Their autonomy, they own their existence. And so you can't use that without someone's permission. But again, going back to public. So if you are walking down Ped Walkway and the Daily Beacon takes pictures of students walking, to class, this is like, halfway through the semester when we were at our peak of the COVID cases, and they're saying, look, there's only 5 students there. You can't say, no, you can't publish my picture because I'm not giving you that permission. You're in public, they can take that picture and they can use it. Okay. So what constitutes a private fact? The publication of private information that would be highly offensive to a reasonable person and is not a matter of legitimate public concern. So examples of private facts are sexual relations, humiliating illnesses, intimate personal letters, family disputes, details of home life, stolen photos, or photos taken in private spaces. Those are considered the publication of private facts. Again, when it comes to public figures, it's a little bit different because of the little caveat that says this is not a matter of legitimate public concern. The public tends to be very concerned with everything that's happening with, the Kardashians or, the politicians like the president, they're overly concerned with that. So having, people publish private facts about that is not considered a violation because they just argue this is of public concern. So in there we have the case of Hilda Bridge. She was actually a private citizen. She had been kidnapped by her ex-husband. He had tortured her. They ended up, the police were called. They came out. She ran out before he shot her because he'd taken all her clothes. And the photographers took a picture of her here where she's naked running out there and all she has is a bath towel covering her up. Well, she sued for private facts and she lost because the incident of her being kidnapped by her ex-husband was of public concern. It was of public interest. And so even though that arguably is a very private moment for her, just barely escaping with her life, they could publish it. So what constitutes false light? So false light, again, is where you change things in context, but it's the widespread publication of facts that places a plaintiff in a false light that is highly offensive to a reasonable person and was published with actual malice. So you know that you're moving the pieces around so that it looks different. With false light, though, you do not have to harm someone's reputation. It only has to be proven that something was false and that it caused the person embarrassment or humiliation. So when we talk about libel, you have to prove that your reputation had been damaged. When we talk about false light, you just have to prove that it hurt your feelings. And in that case, it's up to the plaintiff to prove that what was written was fictionalized and or distortion. And one of my favorite cases of all time is Hustler v. Falwell. That's a false light case. He sued because Hustler, an adult magazine, ran a parody ad that was based on advertisements that were running a lot during this time, where people will talk about my first time, and they were actually talking about drinking a particular liquor drink. Well, Hustler had ran this parody. They had said that it was a parody in it, but in their parody, they had Jerry Falwell, who's an evangelist preacher, well known, write that his first time drinking this liquor resulted in him losing his virginity to his mom in an outhouse. Well, he was distressed by that because it caused him great emotional distress to have that written. He sued for false light, and he lost because it was a parody. The court found that no reasonable person was going to believe this. But what I find interesting about that is, Falwell apparently had not heard of the Streisand effect. The probability of somebody who listens to his preachings and follows him in his religious circle reading Hustler was so slim that had he not brought this case before the courts, nobody probably would have known about it. Now it's living on in infamy. Now everybody knows about it. It's something that you have to learn, when you're going through common law. And so I just find it kind of funny that, like, had he just walked away and said, oh, it's silly, no one's going to believe it, he would not now be remembered for, this ad that made such scandalous claims.
I went to Liberty University last year, and I believe that's where Jerry Falwell's son also
Yes.
is, what is it? Headmaster?
He was, yeah.
Yeah, and he was crapped on all the time, just like that entire family was, because of how they display themselves in the media.
Yeah, speaking of his son, I don't know if you all, like, he had his own scandal because he had not been behaving in ways that he had touted that he wanted his followers to behave in. And it actually, whether or not it's true, was forced to resign from being headmaster at Liberty University just this year because a waiter had come out and said that baby Falwell had let him have intercourse with his wife while, the headmaster Falwell watched and played the piano. It was a really crazy story, and he had to resign because he was not, representing the university well. But I think it's kind of funny because you have the story of, the parody of the elder Falwell, and now this scandal with, the younger Falwell playing out in the media, and it tickles my funny bone. Like,
It's crazy.
So next we have what constitutes appropriation. So the use of a person's name, likeness, or image without their permission for commercial gain. So if somebody is using you for commercial gain, you can sue for appropriation. For private individuals, you just have to prove emotional damage. You just have to prove that using your likeness hurt your feelings. But for public figures, you have to prove that there was an economic harm. So you have to prove that these people using your likeness, violate or caused you to lose money. And in that you have Midler v. Ford Motors. Ford wanted to use Midler's, song, which they could just purchase the copyright license for, but they wanted Midler to sing it. She refused to do it for their commercial. They found someone who sounded just like Bette Midler to sing the song. They used it so that when people were watching, they thought, oh, that's Bette Midler. And she actually sued and won because Ford had appropriated her likeness. They had used her sound in a deceptive way so that people thought it was her, and she has a right to own her likeness. So what constitutes the invasion of private space? Again, I'll give you all a hint. The freedom of press gives you the right to publish, but it does not give you the right to gather news. So I think that you guys are going to be, or maybe that was last one, I don't know. But essentially what that means is that anything that happens in the public, you have a right to publish, you have a right to cover. But anything else that's considered private, particularly for private individuals, you have to tread lightly, because you can publish something even if it was obtained illegally. If you did not take part in that, if you were not a part of the illegal action that gathered the information, you can publish it. But if you take part in it in any way, then you are liable for it, and you have invaded someone's privacy. So things that I want you guys to ponder as you move forward. So there's no legal definition of hate speech. And I want you guys to think, can hate speech be defined? If so, how? If not, why? Hint, what are the differences between hate speech and fighting words? Is there a difference? Because again, remember, fighting words will bring a reasonable person to acts of violence. Would hate speech qualify for that? Next, historically in times of war, the First Amendment rights are lessened or stripped away entirely. Why do you think this occurs? And is this action justified? So compare Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Chief Justice Earl Warren's interpretation of the First Amendment. What were the differences? And then finally, have we given up the right to privacy now that we are in a social media culture? This is really important for your generation. So I want you guys to think about that. If we have, can we get it back, and how? And if we have not given up our right to privacy, how are we actively protecting it? And hint, if it's fair to publish a private person's private facts if they did nothing to make themselves newsworthy. So I'm just curious what you all think about the last one. Do you think that we still have an expectation of privacy in the modern social media world with TikTok and YouTube and Twitter? Do we have that expectation of privacy?
I think it's kind of vanished. I follow this one lady who's a perfect example of this, who she is a foster parent. And obviously when you're a foster parent, you can't like post pictures of the kid or like say their name or anything. And she, but obviously is in a social media age. And so she'll like post pictures of the kids, and she'll like cover up their faces with like a heart emoji, and then she's like made nicknames for them. So like she her youngest that she like eventually adopted, for a long time they just called her Anne, like on social media. And so I always thought it was really interesting how like, even though it was technically like it was very illegal if she actually posted a picture of her daughter before she adopted her, but like people still wanted to like know her life at that, and how she was able to like still show what her foster kids were doing, even though she couldn't show their faces or names. And I thought it was really weird that she felt like she had to like put them out there without putting that, like, if that makes sense.
No, I know what you mean. Like, what was the purpose of sharing any of that? Like, why would any like traditional people, why would you care about someone not close to you who has foster children, and why would you want to follow their story? I mean, to me, what you're describing is almost like exploitative of the kids. Like, I'm such a great person, I've got a new one, I'm catching them all, it's like Pokemon Go. But I mean, I think that one's particularly interesting because maybe she's not violating her own expectation of privacy, but I definitely do think that she's doing it for children, for the kids, because even if there's a heart emoji over there will be ways to identify them, and if they're in any kind of danger or anything like that, it's possible that someone could figure things out based on what she's doing. So anybody else, what do you think? Do you think that the modern digital age has changed our expectation of privacy? When you post something, do you expect it to be private?
No, I think if you post something, you're volunteering that information. That's not private anymore. It's, if you give it to Facebook or wherever, then people can share that, and it can, it's automatically public at that point. Even if you just have a set list of friends on your Facebook, they can take that information to other people, not, they can either share it on Facebook or just tell someone and gossip about it. Like anything you post on any social media, you are volunteering that information.
Yes, it's a really good point. Because if you think about instances of, students putting on blackface and sending the picture to a friend, well, they share it with somebody and they share it with somebody and then it gets out. Well, you can't say, well, I just posted it on my Snapchat to just the individuals that could see it, because anybody could grab that information and anybody can put it out.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
I would agree with both of you that the digital age has changed our understanding for privacy. And in some ways, we have honestly almost at this point given it up because of how we have become that digital society, where we would, take in foster children, but feel that we had to post about it. Like Alexander was pointing out, we take in children and, we have to post about it. Well, you don't have to, you choose to. So we do put a lot more of our lives out there. So the expectation of privacy is definitely dwindling. And I'm just curious to see how that plays out in the courts in the future and how that will reshape our understanding of the First Amendment. So are there any questions about anything?
What do you think the difference between hate speech and fighting words are?
So if I were to define hate speech, fighting words says, if a reasonable person is brought to acts of violence. I would argue that if a reasonable person within a historically marginalized or disenfranchised group would be brought to an act of violence upon hearing that it would qualify as hate speech. And that's how I would do it, because I understand the slippery slope argument. I really do. But we are a society that has a history, and we know our history. So we know what hate speech is. If we very much can have the obscenity rule of I know it when I see it, we could very much have it for hate speech too. So I would say that that's really not a whole lot of difference, other than it is based on, a historical understanding within our society.
Okay. I agree with that. I think enough hate speech can lead to fighting words. It can definitely escalate, or that's how I interpreted it.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely can. And, fighting words, it's really up to, I guess, your local attorneys, your district attorney's office and stuff, whether or not they acknowledge that rationale. Now, you can take it to the court and win, but, if you hear something and it causes you to commit acts of violence, it depends on really would any other reasonable person find it that way. And when it comes to hate speech, I would say that most reasonable people would agree that stirs something in them. Most reasonable people would agree that when they see swastikas painted on the rock, they don't just walk past and say, "Oh, that's a shame." Like there's something visceral. There's something that it stirs in you that makes you brokenhearted and angry and that type of thing. And so I think that reasonable people would be brought to, some sort of act based on hate speech or on, fighting words. So
That makes sense. Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I think we're out of time now.
Well,
James
what
on.
I'd like
Did you have a question, James? Because I speak really fast and answer it. No. All right. So, Dr. Rosner?
Yeah, well, first of all, I just wanted to tell the class, if you can, let's give Sheila Hawkins a round of applause. I think she shared a really fascinating lecture and conversation dialogue with you around our First Amendment rights and around privacy. And so I just want to thank her for that. And and I appreciate it more than you know, Sheila. Your knowledge here is so strong, and I look forward to seeing you at another university and teaching kind of a future generation of journalists about the importance of the First Amendment. So thank you very, very much.